The man who had executed a king was now facing his own execution, not by soldiers, not by rebels, but by his own failing body. On a storm-lashed afternoon in September 1658, Oliver Cromwell lay dying in Whitehall Palace, his organs shutting down one by one. Thunder rolled across London as his skin burned with fever and his strength disappeared. Within hours he would be gone. Later doctors would cut open his body and find something inside his spleen so dark and unnatural it looked like thick black oil. And here's the shocking truth. Cromwell didn't have to die this way. A cure existed. It was known. It was effective. But it was never taken. To understand how England's most powerful man ended up powerless before his own body, we must go back to the moment this invisible enemy first entered his blood, years before anyone realised the fate it would bring. The story must now move backward, to a time when Oliver Cromwell seemed almost untouchable. 9 years before his death, he was at the absolute height of his power. England no longer had a king, Parliament bent to his will, the army obeyed him without question. He carried the title of Lord Protector, but in truth he ruled like a monarch in all but name. He had defeated royalist armies, crushed rebellions, and reshaped the government of an entire nation. Many feared him, many worshipped him, and Cromwell himself believed that God had chosen him for this role. He did not see himself as a tyrant. He saw himself as a servant of divine purpose. Every victory, every battlefield success, every political triumph reinforced his belief that heaven was guiding his hand. When he dissolved Parliament by force, he believed it was necessary. When he ruled without elections, he believed it was righteous. When he ordered violence, he believed it was God's will. Cromwell was not driven by doubt. He was driven by certainty, and certainty can be a dangerous thing. In 1649, that certainty carried him across the sea to Ireland. The island was largely Catholic and deeply hostile to English rule. Cromwell was sent to crush resistance and impose order, and he did so with ruthless efficiency. His campaign would become infamous for its brutality, remembered for massacres that shocked even his supporters. To Cromwell, this was not cruelty. It was judgment. He believed that mercy toward his enemies was a betrayal of his faith. At this moment in his life, Cromwell felt protected by destiny. He believed no enemy could truly harm him. He commanded men, armies, and nations. He did not know that his greatest enemy was already waiting, not on the battlefield, but in the land itself, silent, patient, and unseen. The end came slowly, cruelly, in the quiet chambers of Whitehall Palace, while the world outside raged in chaos. Oliver Cromwell, once the most feared man in England, the man who had signed a king's death warrant without hesitation, was now facing a different kind of execution. No army, no conspirator, no blade would end him. His own body had become the executioner. On September 3rd, 1658, the Lord Protector lay shivering and sweating, his organs failing one by one as a violent storm tore through London, rattling windows, bending trees, and drenching the streets. Each wave of pain and fever reminded those around him that power, no matter how absolute, could not shield one from the ultimate fate every human must face. Physicians hovered anxiously, their hands trembling as they performed what they would later call a gruesome autopsy, cutting into his body to find horrors within. The spleen, filled with a dark, sludge-like substance resembling the thick leaves that settle at the bottom of an oil jar. It was a morbid and grotesque revelation of the battle that had raged inside him for years, hidden from his awareness and from all human understanding at the time. And yet there was a cruel twist to this ending. A medicine existed that could have saved him, a simple, effective cure that his own pride and prejudice would not allow him to take. Jesuits' powder, known across Europe to halt the recurring fevers that plagued those with the same disease, lay within reach, untouched because it came from the people he despised most. The irony was stark and immediate. The man who had brought kings to the scaffold was dying from something smaller than a human hand, something invisible, something that had been with him for almost a decade. To fully understand how a man who seemed invincible could be brought so low, we must travel back, step by step, to the moment this unseen enemy first entered his life and began its relentless, unseen siege. At the height of his power, Oliver Cromwell was a figure that commanded both awe and fear. As Lord Protector of England, Scotland and Ireland, he had reshaped the very fabric of the nation, wielding authority with a combination of military genius and unyielding religious conviction. Every decision he made was filtered through his belief that God had chosen him for a divine mission, and he carried that conviction like armour, both visible and invisible, to protect his mind and his body against the relentless challenges of leadership. The armies under his command had never been defeated, and his political acumen kept potential rivals and rebellious nobles in check, fearful of the consequences of defiance. Yet, it was during this era of dominance that Cromwell made choices that would unknowingly set the stage for his later vulnerability. His campaign in Ireland, in particular, marked a turning point that combined both glory and calamity. Marching through marshlands and bogs, crushing resistance and imposing Protestant rule with uncompromising brutality, he left a trail of devastation behind him. He oversaw massacres at Drogheda and Wexford, events that would stain his legacy with blood and horror, yet he viewed them as necessary steps to enforce order and serve God's will. This period of triumph created a paradox. A man capable of orchestrating battles with precise strategy and cold efficiency would soon face an adversary no battlefield could prepare him for, one that entered silently and invisibly, yet would prove far more destructive than any army. In these months of conquest, surrounded by the spoils of victory and the trappings of absolute authority, Cromwell could not have imagined that the seeds of his downfall were already planted, waiting quietly in the damp, mosquito-laden air of Irish marshes. The contrast between this commanding, unshakable figure and the fragile, fever-racked man he would become is both stark and tragic, illustrating that even the greatest power is powerless against the smallest of enemies. In the damp, treacherous marshlands of southern Ireland, Oliver Cromwell trudged through mud that sucked at his boots and air thick with humidity, carrying the buzzing of countless mosquitoes. It was a landscape both beautiful and deadly, a place where the ground squelched beneath every step, and the smell of stagnant water hung in the air. Cromwell, confident in his military might and the righteousness of his cause, had come to crush resistance and impose his vision of Protestant rule, never imagining that the real threat to him would not be musket fire, cannonballs, or a treacherous enemy on the battlefield. Instead, it came in the form of a nearly invisible enemy, a single, tiny mosquito carrying a parasite that would burrow quietly into his bloodstream. That first illness, a seemingly minor fever that left him shivering and weak, was dismissed by Cromwell as a trivial inconvenience, a fleeting weakness in his otherwise unstoppable body. Yet this small encounter was monumental, marking the beginning of a silent, relentless siege that would continue for the rest of his life. The disease hid in his liver, waiting patiently, multiplying quietly, preparing to strike at the moments of greatest weakness. Over time, it would emerge in violent, recurring fevers, leaving Cromwell vulnerable in body and mind, eroding the invincibility that had carried him to victories across kingdoms. What began as a minor illness in the Irish marshes would become a lifelong torment, a hidden adversary no sword or strategy could defeat. The irony is staggering. The same campaign in which he sought to impose control over foreign lands was also the moment when control over his own body began to slip away. The invisible enemy had entered, patient and lethal, forever altering the course of his life and, as history would reveal, the fate of England itself. 2 years after that first encounter with disease in the Irish marshes, Cromwell found himself again at the mercy of a fever that would leave him fighting for his life. During his campaign in Scotland, he was struck violently, shivering uncontrollably under heavy blankets, his body drenched in sweat, teeth chattering, and mind slipping in and out of delirium. The same man who had ridden at the head of undefeated armies, who had faced cannon fire and marched through blood-soaked fields without fear, now lay vulnerable in a Scottish castle, unable to stand or even call for assistance without trembling. Outside his chamber, officers whispered quietly, unsure whether to begin planning for a successor, their fear of the unknown mingling with awe at the power that had once seemed eternal. Physicians rushed from London, taking more than a week to reach him, bringing every remedy they could muster, leeches to draw out imagined poisons, purges to cleanse his system, and every tonic and elixir they had available. But still the fever raged, a relentless enemy immune to command or coercion. Somehow, against the odds, Cromwell survived. But survival did not mean recovery. The attack left him physically weaker, and though he would rise again to resume leadership and continue his campaigns, the experience had changed him. His body now carried the memory of the disease, a lingering reminder that even the most powerful man could not control everything, that mortality could strike silently, unpredictably, and with devastating effect. From that moment onward, the cycle of illness and partial recovery would shape his life, undermining his health in ways that no battlefield could, and setting the stage for the final, inexorable decline that would ultimately claim England's Lord Protector. The invisible enemy, once dismissed as a minor inconvenience, had revealed itself as a permanent patient adversary. As the years passed, the impact of Cromwell's illness became painfully visible to all who encountered him. Diplomats from across Europe, visiting England to negotiate and observe, could not help but notice the subtle but alarming changes in the Lord Protector's appearance. The Venetian ambassador, writing in secret cipher to his superiors, described Cromwell as looking drawn and frail, a shadow of the commanding figure he had once been. Even small gestures revealed the erosion of his physical strength. When Cromwell removed his hat to greet someone, the hand holding it trembled uncontrollably, a detail that may have seemed minor but carried enormous symbolic weight. This was the same man who had led charges into cannon fire, who had signed the death warrant of a king with a steady hand and unflinching resolve. The trembling hand spoke not just of physical weakness, but of the invisible, relentless enemy that had taken residence inside his body, steadily undermining his invincibility. The recurring fevers had become a cruel routine, each wave of cold, hot, and collapsing weakness stripping away more of the vitality that had allowed him to dominate armies and govern nations with authority. What once was the image of unshakable power was now a man marked by vulnerability, his strength eroded by a disease no sword could defeat. Those around him began to sense it too, a subtle but undeniable change that foreshadowed the ultimate collapse to come. His enemies might not have seen it immediately, but his closest advisers and family recognised that the man who had seemed unstoppable was now a fragile figure, subject to forces far beyond human control. Even Cromwell himself must have felt the creeping inevitability, the knowledge that time and illness could breach the defences of even the strongest ruler. The Lord Protector, once a symbol of dominance, was now a man whose body betrayed him, a haunting contrast to the unstoppable figure of history's memory. The pattern of Cromwell's illness was cruelly methodical, a cycle that returned again and again, leaving both his body and those around him in dread. Each attack began with a sudden and violent shivering, a cold so intense it made his teeth chatter uncontrollably and his bed seem like a cage he could not escape. No fire, no blankets, no care could warm him during these episodes, as if his own blood had turned against him. Then, almost without warning, the cold would give way to a scorching heat that left his skin burning to the touch and his clothes soaked in sweat. Vomiting and diarrhea followed, relentless and merciless, while his throat became raw from constant retching, and a cough brought up flecks of blood. What physicians of the 17th century could not understand was that each wave was the result of millions of microscopic parasites, the remnants of a mosquito bite in Ireland almost a decade earlier, bursting in synchronized waves from his red blood cells and overwhelming his immune system. Each attack was not just a symptom, but a battle within his body, one that grew weaker him with every iteration. After the fever broke, there would be a brief reprieve, a false recovery, during which Cromwell could rise, speak, dictate letters, and even conduct council business. Yet with every cycle, his strength diminished, leaving him more vulnerable and more dependent on others. The invisible war inside him was relentless, tireless, and perfectly timed to exploit moments of weakness. What had begun as a minor illness in the marshes of Ireland had become an invisible adversary, undermining the man who had seemed invincible, reshaping him slowly, insidiously, into a fragile shadow of the once powerful Lord Protector. Understanding this cycle is essential because it explains not only his physical decline, but also the subtle cracks that appeared in his leadership, paranoia, and decision-making, all of which were exacerbated by the relentless hidden enemy within. As the physical toll of his illness mounted, the psychological consequences became impossible to ignore. Cromwell, once a man who faced battlefields with unshakable courage, now found his mind under siege as well as his body. He began to wear armour under his clothing, a precaution that seemed excessive even for a military leader, but one that reflected the anxiety coursing through him. Rooms were changed nightly, Routes of travel were altered at the last minute, and the people closest to him could see the signs of a mind constantly on edge. Some of this fear was justified. Royalists and other enemies were actively plotting against him. Yet part of it stemmed from the subtle, insidious effects of chronic illness. Malaria and repeated fevers can affect the brain, causing anxiety, mood swings, and paranoia. It was almost impossible to separate reality from the distorted perceptions brought on by the disease. Decisions that might have once been simple required elaborate precautions, and every shadow, every whisper, and every delay was interpreted as a potential threat. Even those who served him faithfully began to notice the strain, the way his eyes darted, the way he hesitated before making choices that had previously been instant and commanding. The very disease that sapped his strength in bed also undermined his ability to trust, to relax, and to lead with the same clarity that had made him a military genius. Slowly, the line between political reality and illness blurred, creating a man whose power remained immense in title, but was increasingly fragile in practice. This internal chaos, hidden from the world but evident to the few who observed closely, marked the beginning of the decline of both the leader and the Commonwealth he had built. Even his enemies could sense it, and those who had once feared Cromwell on the battlefield may have begun to see cracks in the armour of his authority. The invisible war raging inside his body had reached the mind, transforming a strategic genius into a man haunted by doubt and fear. In the midst of his physical suffering and growing paranoia, Cromwell faced a blow that would pierce the very core of his being, the illness and impending death of his beloved daughter, Elizabeth. Known affectionately as Betty, she was not only his favourite child, but also a moral compass in a life otherwise dominated by rigid Puritan principles and ruthless political decisions. While Cromwell's other children largely followed his stern religious path, Elizabeth displayed compassion and reason, often intervening to spare lives and reduce punishments for those who opposed her father. Her gentle influence had been a rare counterbalance to his harshness, a reminder that even the Lord Protector could act with mercy and humanity. Now she was gravely ill, her body ravaged by what physicians suspected was cancer, and nothing he could do could relieve her suffering. Contemporary accounts describe Cromwell at her bedside, praying, weeping, and even bargaining with God, offering his own life in exchange for hers. The emotional weight of this tragedy was compounded by the recent loss of his youngest grandson Oliver, leaving Elizabeth as the last bright light in his family. Rumours quickly spread, some suggesting that Elizabeth, in her final moments, accused her father of bloodshed and demanded repentance. Though these tales were likely royalist propaganda, still, the grief was real and immediate. Her death in early August of 1658 shattered Cromwell, leaving him physically and mentally weakened, vulnerable to the disease that had already taken so much from him. The emotional devastation created a perfect storm in which fever, grief, and exhaustion combined, stripping away the last vestiges of resilience. The death of Elizabeth marked a turning point. The man who had once shaped nations was now reduced to a grieving father, overwhelmed by sorrow and powerless against forces both human and microscopic. It was in this crucible of loss that the final phase of his decline began, a blend of heartbreak, illness, and the inexorable march of fate that would soon claim him. By the end of July 1658, what had begun as ordinary ailments now signalled the start of Cromwell's final battle. Initially, he suffered from what seemed like a typical bout of gout, a common affliction among England's elite, caused by rich foods and a life of indulgence. At first, advisors and physicians dismissed it as nothing unusual, just another minor inconvenience in the life of a powerful man. But within days, the familiar terrifying pattern of his recurring fevers returned with renewed intensity. The attacks became more frequent and more violent, hitting him with the cruel regularity that only years of malaria could produce. Each wave of cold, heat, and collapse seemed to sap not only his physical strength, but also the hope of recovery in those around him. Between episodes, there were brief moments when he appeared almost normal, rising from his bed, speaking with advisors, and attending to state business, giving a cruel illusion of improvement. These false recoveries were particularly cruel, allowing both Cromwell and those close to him to imagine that he might survive, only for the next attack to strike with greater ferocity. By the end of July and into early August, 5 separate attacks had left him increasingly frail. each leaving him weaker and more vulnerable to the next. It was a relentless assault on a body already ravaged by years of disease, compounded by grief over the death of his daughter and the stress of maintaining power in a fragile commonwealth. The invisible enemy within him had grown stronger than the man who had once commanded armies without fear. This was not a temporary setback, but the beginning of an irreversible decline, a final chapter that would not end with strategy, skill or courage, but with the merciless advance of illness, unstoppable and indiscriminate. The once indomitable Lord Protector now faced a foe that even his unparalleled power could not resist. By early September 1658, the full horror of Cromwell's final illness was undeniable. His body, once a weapon of unmatched strength, was now a vessel of relentless suffering. The cold shivers returned with a force that shook the bed itself, teeth chattering violently as his skin turned pale and clammy. Soon the heat phase followed, leaving him drenched in sweat, burning as though fire coursed beneath his skin. Vomiting and diarrhea struck mercilessly, leaving him unable to retain even water, his throat raw and inflamed from constant retching. A persistent cough developed, sometimes bringing up blood, each spasm racking his weakened frame. The pain inside him was indescribable. He claimed that his back and stomach felt as if they were being torn apart from the inside. Modern medical analysis suggests this was his spleen swelling and struggling to filter the millions of damaged blood cells produced by recurring malaria attacks, each cycle more violent than the last. Between these attacks he regained brief moments of coherence, enough to speak, dictate letters, and even joke, but each respite was weaker than the last. The body that had led armies and conquered kingdoms was now at the mercy of microscopic parasites, leaving him entirely dependent on others for survival. Witnesses noted the contrast between the once indomitable Lord Protector and the man shivering, sweating and gasping in his bed. The horror was not only in the physical pain but also in the helplessness, the stark reality that no power, no strategy, no weapon could save him. The mighty Oliver Cromwell, whose name had struck fear across Europe, faced an enemy inside his own blood, relentless, invisible, and utterly indifferent to his status or past victories. This was death in its most intimate and merciless form. As Cromwell's body continued to deteriorate, a bitter and tragic irony shadowed his final days. There existed a medicine that could have ended the relentless cycle of fever and weakness, a cure that had saved countless lives across Europe. Known as Jesuit's powder, or cinchona bark, it contained quinine, a compound capable of targeting the malaria parasites that had been multiplying in his bloodstream for nearly a decade. A few doses could have broken the fever cycle, potentially granting the Lord Protector weeks, months, or even years of life. Yet Cromwell never took it. The reason lay not in ignorance, but in prejudice. The medicine came from Jesuit missionaries in Catholic Peru and had been distributed by enemies he despised. For a man who had outlawed Catholic practices in England, fought bloody campaigns against Irish Catholics, and declared the Pope the embodiment of the Antichrist, accepting this remedy would have felt like a betrayal of everything he believed. Even when offered, he refused, turning away from the very substance that might have saved him. It is almost impossible to overstate the cruel paradox. The man who had executed a king, who had wielded the sword of life and death over countless others, now faced his own death with a cure literally within reach, yet beyond the bounds of his rigid convictions. Some historians debate whether he was actually offered the powder or if it is later myth, but the outcome is indisputable. Cromwell's body succumbed, while the knowledge of a possible salvation remained untaken, untouched by his pride and fear of spiritual contamination. This refusal underscores the intersection of ideology, religion, and mortality, showing that no matter how powerful one becomes, even a lifetime of dominance cannot overcome the limits of the human body or the consequences of rigid belief. The ultimate irony is profound. Death did not come from enemies with swords or conspiracies, but from a tiny parasite and a stubborn refusal to accept life-saving help. Even in the face of unbearable physical suffering, Cromwell's mind remained sharp enough to reflect on his life, his enemies, and the legacy he would leave behind. His final hours were marked not just by pain, but by a profound awareness of his place in history and the judgment of those who would survive him. Witnesses recorded that he prayed with remarkable clarity, acknowledging his own failings while simultaneously seeking guidance for the future of England. He did not limit his prayers to personal salvation. Instead, he asked forgiveness for those who wished him harm, showing a surprising sense of empathy for the very people who had spent years plotting against him. He recognised that many saw him as a tyrant, a man who had executed a king and waged ruthless wars, and yet he prayed for them, calling them God's people even as they celebrated his agony. These prayers reveal a man grappling with mortality, conscience, and the weight of responsibility. He understood that his actions, justified or condemned, had shaped the fate of a nation, and he seemed determined to reconcile his earthly deeds with spiritual accountability. In these moments, Cromwell was neither a general nor a statesman, but a human being confronting the ultimate inevitability: death. His self-awareness extended beyond his personal fate. He considered the stability of the Commonwealth, the vulnerability of his successor, and the fragile state of the nation he had ruled with such force. Even as his body betrayed him, his mind wrestled with providence, morality, and history. The contrast is striking. A man who had once wielded power over life and death, now confined to his bed, praying for others even as his own end approached. These final acts of reflection and prayer add a deeply human layer to his story, showing that amid suffering, fear, and impending death, a measure of conscience and awareness can persist, even in the most hardened of rulers. September 3rd, 1658, was a day steeped in irony and portent, a date Cromwell had long considered lucky, marking some of his greatest military victories at Dunbar in 1650 and Worcester in 1651. Yet on this day, the Lord Protector faced the final, fatal fever that would end his life. By morning, he was barely able to speak, his body trembling violently from the relentless cycles of cold and heat that had plagued him for years. Attendants noted how frail he had become, the once commanding figure reduced to whispers and shivering. Outside, a violent storm raged over London, winds tearing through the streets, toppling trees and battering roofs. Citizens would later speak of the storm as extraordinary for September, framing it in their minds as either divine wrath or sorrow, depending on political and religious allegiances. Some royalists claimed it was the devil himself coming to claim Cromwell's soul, while his supporters interpreted it as God mourning the loss of his servant. Inside Whitehall Palace, however, none of that mattered. The focus was entirely on the man lying in his bed, whose body had been waging an invisible war for years. The fever reached its apex in the afternoon, leaving him barely conscious, whispering prayers and mumbling about England's future. At approximately 3 o'clock, he drew his final breath, bringing an end to a life that had reshaped the British Isles, toppled monarchs, and commanded armies that had never lost a battle. The alignment of date, storm, and death imbued the moment with mythic resonance, ensuring that history would remember not just the fact of Cromwell's passing, but the symbolic power of the day. It was a fittingly dramatic conclusion to a life defined by intensity, ambition, and unrelenting conflict, as the Lord Protector, once feared and revered, finally succumbed to the very fragility that all humans share. The day after Cromwell's death, physicians gathered to examine the body of a man whose life had shaped the course of England. The autopsy revealed the full extent of the devastation wrought by years of illness. His brain was overheated and vessels overcharged, suggesting severe inflammation and perhaps cerebral swelling, a consequence of repeated fevers that had taxed his body beyond recovery. The lungs were engorged with fluid, explaining the coughing fits and difficulty breathing in his final days. Yet it was the spleen that told the most revealing story. While its size was normal, it was filled with a dark, thick substance that contemporaries described as resembling the leaves of oil, the sludge that settles at the bottom of an oil container. Modern medical understanding interprets this as evidence of repeated malaria attacks or severe sepsis, the spleen having become a repository for damaged and dead blood cells. Each fever cycle over the years had left its mark, slowly weakening his organs and eroding his resilience. The physicians, expecting poison or foul play, found disease instead, a grim confirmation that the man who had executed kings and commanded armies had been felled not by enemies' swords, but by a microscopic parasite and the cascading effects of years of chronic illness. This autopsy not only explained the physical cause of his death, but also revealed the cruel irony. a ruler of unparalleled power reduced to vulnerability, a reminder that no amount of authority can shield anyone from the ultimate impartiality of nature and disease. The discovery left those present both fascinated and horrified, confronting the delicate boundary between historical legend and human fragility, as they realised that the invisible enemy had claimed the Lord Protector in a way that history, politics and power could not prevent. Even after death, Cromwell's story of suffering and indignity continued in ways that were both bizarre and tragic. The embalming process, intended to preserve the Lord Protector for a state funeral, failed catastrophically. His body, wrapped in 6 layers of waxed cloth, placed inside a lead shell and enclosed in a wooden coffin with sweet herbs, began to swell and decompose almost immediately. The stench became so unbearable that those charged with handling the remains were forced to secretly enter the corpse to avoid scandal, leaving the grand funeral to proceed without the body. Instead, a lifelike effigy was created from wood and wax, complete with a carefully crafted death mask that had been taken shortly after his passing. This dummy was dressed in the purple robes of state and displayed in Somerset House, lying in state from September through November, fooling thousands of visitors and even foreign ambassadors who believed they were paying respects to the real Oliver Cromwell. The grotesque reality of the decaying corpse hidden away contrasted sharply with the ceremonious public display, illustrating the lengths to which officials went to maintain appearances. The failure of the embalming and the creation of a substitute body became part of Cromwell's enduring legacy, highlighting not only the physical horrors of his death, but also the political pressures and social expectations surrounding the image of a ruler. It was a haunting spectacle, a reminder that death does not always align with dignity or intent, and that the power Cromwell wielded in life could not protect him from the indignities imposed even after death. This strange chapter ensured that the memory of Cromwell's body, rotting in secret while a convincing imitation lay in state, would become part of the grim mythology surrounding his life and death, a story that blurred the line between reality, ritual and macabre spectacle. Even after death, Oliver Cromwell's story did not end, but took an almost surreal turn that blurred the line between history and spectacle. With the monarchy restored in 1660, vengeance was sought not against the living Lord Protector, he was gone, but against his corpse. On January 30th, 1661, the exhumed body was publicly humiliated alongside the remains of his allies, hanged at Tyburn like common criminals, and then decapitated. Cromwell's head was impaled on a 20-foot pike above Westminster Hall, where it remained for decades as a grim warning to anyone who might challenge the crown. Over the next 3 centuries, the head passed through private collectors, public exhibitions and even museums, a grotesque symbol of political revenge and fascination, until it was finally buried in secret at Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge. This bizarre posthumous journey underscores the strange and enduring power of history, memory and symbolism. Cromwell, a man who had wielded unparalleled authority in life, became powerless even in death, his legacy debated, dissected and displayed for generations. Yet, beyond the macabre, his life and death offer profound lessons. A mosquito bite in the Irish marshes of 1649, the stubborn refusal to take a life-saving medicine, and the relentless toll of disease combined with personal grief to end the Commonwealth and restore the monarchy. The smallest, most invisible forces, parasites, prejudice and human vulnerability, proved mightier than armies, politics or ideology. Cromwell's death reminds us that no amount of power can conquer mortality, that pride and ideology can shape fate as forcefully as any enemy, and that history often turns on the most unexpected and microscopic actors. In the end, the man who executed a king was executed by circumstance, by disease, and by his own body. History remembered him not only as a conqueror and ruler, but as a cautionary tale of power, mortality, and the ironic fragility of life. The storm that raged as he died mirrors the storms of history he both shaped and could not escape, leaving a legacy as extraordinary as it is haunting.